Should I avoid this? Then
I can unmute myself, or shall I unmute? It's okay. I'm back. So yes,
you'll have your tea in peace for a couple of minutes, and we'll start.
But it's already being recorded or live streamed?
Yeah, we're live right now at the moment.
Okay. Okie doke. Actually, I have this picture both at the beginning and the end.
Mute.
So can I ask them some questions?
Yeah.
As I start. Yeah.
You can maneuver this as you like.
Yes, thank you.
I'll take a few minutes to introduce you and then we'll get the session going.
Sure.
Yeah. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to ENTENTE 2023 and the plenary session 2. We are here with Professor Firoza Juswala. Ma'am, let me take this honor to introduce you.
Thank you.
Professor Dr. Josewala is Professor Emerita from the University of New Mexico and in Albuquerque. She's taught at the university level for more than 40 years, beginning her years as a TA at the University of Utah and then at University of Texas, and as a full professor of English and post-colonial literatures at the University of New Mexico. She is the author of the very famous book, Family Quarrels Towards a Criticism of Indian Writing in English, co-editor of interviews with writers of the post-colonial world, emerging South Asian women writers, memory, voice, and identity. She also edited Mr. Naipaul's interviews given through his career to various newspapers and journals into Conversations with V.S. Naipaul. Ma'am, I hold a copy of this book. It's very dear to me, which was both translated into French and featured on Sir Naipaul's Nobel Prize page. She has co-taught an NEH seminar and an NEH Institute on Post-Colonial Literatures housed at the School of Asian and African Studies in London. She's also won prestigious grants such as the Rockefeller Foundation Residency in Bellagio, Italy, and the Alumni Teaching Award at the University of New Mexico. She's author of more than 300 articles and book chapters, primarily on Indian writing in English, post-colonial literatures in English, Indian critical theory, D.H. Lawrence, and Muslims and women's writing, written from 1979 onwards. Her book of poems, Chiffon Saris, that was published in 2003 by the Kolkata Writers' Workshop and the Toronto South Asian Review. Recently, she served as the chair of the MLA's Delegate Assembly Organizing Committee. Thank you, ma'am, for taking out the time and coming to speak to us about interpretive communities and situational context. It's very, very pertinent and very relevant to what the world we live in today. And I think it's going to be a very, very enlightening and stimulating session for all our viewers who are watching us online and the host of students watching you here live. Thank you, ma'am. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Ratika. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for allowing me to talk to you a little bit about interpretive communities. So the reason I have this slide first, this one was Dr. Mulder was my PhD chair at the University of Utah. And the reason I have this slide is that it was actually the beginning of my work on interpretive communities and why we need interpretive communities. Do any of you recognize any of the people here in this picture? Anyone?
Yeah.
You've got some names underneath that. So this is my professor, Dr. Mulder. That's his wife, Helen Mulder. This is R.K. Narayan. How many of you have read any R.K. Narayan? Swami and Friends, the English teacher, Bachelor of Arts, the painter of Malgudi. Everybody knows Narayan. Can you just tell me by yes or no? You needn't raise hand, but just make a noise or something. This is Raja Rao. This is Raja Rao. How many of you know who Raja Rao is? Yes, Raja Rao, major author of Kantapura, Serpent and the Rope. And this is C.D. Narasimhaya. How many of you know of C.D. Narasimhaya, who founded Dhvanya Loka in Mysore, which is basically an interpretive community. So the reason I have this picture up here, and I have it also at the end, is that when I started writing my dissertation, there was not a proper criticism for Indian literatures written in English. And I know that Ratika told me that you all are not actually all English literature people, but from various other disciplines. And so you are looking to see how interpretive communities work around the world, maybe globally, and maybe also in terms of business communication, and so forth. So the reason I have these people up here is because Indian writing in English was being measured by the yardstick at that time. When I wrote my thesis, this is before post-colonial literature and theory, or the definition of the idea of the post-colonial. This was when Indian writing in English was still called Commonwealth literature in English. And people were using still British yardsticks for measuring whether this was good. Narayan, as you know, is a major one of our writers. But people would say, oh, Narayan is, his writing is very simple. He cannot really write very beautifully or lyrically. And in my thesis, which was called Family Quarrels Towards a Criticism of Indian Writing in English, and then was published by Peter Lang and has been in circulation for these last 40 years, I asked, well, who is the one to say whether Narayan is writing beautifully or not? What is the interpretive community? Do we want Indian writers writing in English to write like Matthew Arnold? Or do we want them to sound like Edmund Goss or any of those kinds of people that we held up for a very long time? Narayan asks those same questions in his memoir, which is called Last Days or something like that, that I don't remember it distinctly. But he remembers his uncle saying to him, you need to write like Dickens. And he said, why Dickens? Why can't I write my stories of Malgudi the way in which grandmother told the stories to me? So what this whole premise of my thesis at that time was to start out and say, there needs to be a contextual interpretation of literature. And context is very important. Context is very important in politics today. Context is very important in the understanding of the world as we understand it, and the way in which we make meaning either from a text, a literary text that is written, if you want, for something that you are reading, and or whether you are making sense of the world around you. Of course, we talk about, I don't know how familiar you all are with theory or literary theory or even social theory, but we talk about the world as a text, right? We talk not just about the fact that a book is a text or a textbook is a text or something you are reading is a text, but the world itself is a text. And we have to make meaning of this world itself, of this text which is around us. How do we make that meaning? We make that meaning based on our, if you're taking politics or political science, or if you're taking sociology, on your political socialization. What do I mean by your political socialization? Your political socialization is the way you look at the world, shaped on what your parents have taught you, your school teachers have taught you, your religious teachers have taught you, your panditji, your if you're Christian, you go to a church, what the ministers in America, the Christian ministers really vastly influence politics, right? They get if you're going to a Baptist church, they love Trump. They're going to talk from the pulpit about Trump being wonderful. They influence the way in which voters will vote. So political socialization is what makes you, what makes your thinking pattern. We say we live in a democracy. In India, we live in a democracy. In the US, we live in a democracy. But in some shape or another, we are brainwashed. We all have our own propaganda or propaganda positions from which we understand the world at large. And that's your political socialization. Each reader, each individual or reader reads from a particular location, from a particular time, and makes sense of that text or that situation out of that particular background. So your background helps you make sense of the world at large. So my second slide says here, no literary event, actually we can say no political event, no literary event embodies and exemplifies the argument of reader response theory more than Salman Rushdie's satanic verses. Because as you know, Rushdie wrote the book. You write a text, you put it out into the world. You release it where many people will look at it and make meaning from their particular point of view. He became a victim of what is called the postmodern condition, where meaning is taken from the hands of the author and put in the minds of a warring group of readers. This then is the classic example of readers making meaning for themselves. So he writes the book, he puts it out. You all know the history of the book. I won't talk about Rushdie a lot, but I'm just using that as an example. He writes the book. Khushwant Singh is one of the editors at the Penguin Random House in India, and he tells and advises the publishers not to publish the book, that it's violent, that it will cause a lot of trouble, it's volatile. Do they listen to him? No. Does his agent, Andrew Wiley, listen to him? No. For Andrew Wiley, he's an agent. He needs to make money. The more books sell, the more money he makes. For him, it's a great opportunity to create a controversy and sell a book. So he puts up the book. He doesn't back off. He puts it up on the New York Times Magazine with a very defiant picture. What happens? That picture, the text, falls in the hands of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who then reads it and says, he didn't read it, he was informed. He says it's blasphemous. He realizes that in that book, he is called a haramzada. So what does he do? He puts out the fatwa. Now in America, many writers said many things about the fact that, it should be free expression of speech, and it's not this. And even Rushdie said, no, it's not this. I didn't mean this. I didn't mean that. But meaning is always made based on where the reader is located and how that particular text or idea is interpreted by an individual or by a group of individuals or by a group of people. Or by a group of people. So that is the most important thing to think about. That is what Stanley Fish called an interpretive community. So how many of you know anything about Stanley Fish? He was a literary critic. He is a literary critic. He has many books. He also has a new book out now about how to write winning arguments. And here's the story about this book. So a student goes to take a graduate student goes to Stanley Fish's office, and he says to him, Dr. Fish, I'm taking this class. Is there a textbook? Is there a text in this class? And Fish turns around to him and he says, is there a text in this class? And the student is surprised because he wants to know if there's a textbook in his class. And that became the title of the book that he wrote, which if you look down here, The Authority of Interpretive Communities. There is no text. And of course, you will say to me, Dr. Jasawala, this is a postmodern concept about the shifting signs, that each sign changes and it changes by location, it changes by time, it changes by reader, and therefore it doesn't make any sense. It's the idea of the shifting signifier and so forth. But that is absolutely true. There is no right or wrong answer in a literary or a political text anywhere. So whenever I have taught English literature or literature writing response papers, I use this book. If you are either interested in literary studies, let me hold it up, either interested in literary studies, or if you are in any other field and trying to make sense and want a quick Reader's Digest distilled version of literary and political social theory, this book is great. It's by a man called Stephen Bonnycastle. It is called In Search of Authority. Where does authority in a text rest? Does it rest with the writer? Does it rest with the reader? Or with the literary critic? And what are the assumptions behind this particular idea? And Bonnycastle starts out right in the beginning, and I used to put this out for my students. This is not relevant in India because in India, I grew up in that system, and I know that we have to take exams, and there is an examiner you don't know, and that examiner has a right answer in his head, and he says, no, you said this or that is wrong. Milton wrote this at this time, and this is what it means. That's not true under the current circumstances. What Bonnycastle asks is, does a work of literature have a single correct meaning or a number of possible meanings? How does an author, Shakespeare or John Irving, become regarded as a great author? What happens when a reader is deeply changed by reading a work of literature? How is a person affected by intense admiration for a certain author? What is the best way to find out more about a book you care for, and so forth? Can literature function like a religion, provide values, a sense of wholeness for an individual? So basically, the modern tenets, the way of teaching literature anymore is that there is the writer, there is the reader, there is a connection, and the reader reads this through his connection. And this is what is very important. And this flies in the face of post-structuralism because the authority it lies in the individual's reading experience. Now, I always, whenever I taught a literature course, or even any other course, world literature or world literature in context, I did not assign students specific papers on specific topics. I told students, you pick a topic, you pick a particular point of view, you pick a topic, and you write about why that topic is important to you. You pick a topic and you write about why a particular way in which you read a text makes meaning. I actually decided on this for a very surreptitious reason. The reason being that a lot of students in the US, when they are asked to turn in a paper, the first paper, the second paper, the third paper, will plagiarize. They'll go to Wikipedia, they'll copy this, they'll copy that, and they put it together. Now, I used to say, hey, what you're taking from Wikipedia is important, but what does it mean to you? How do you react to it? I'm not going to read a basic summary. Milton was born at this time, he lived here, he wrote this. I don't want that. I want to know how you interact with Lycidas, or how you interact with a certain poem, or if it's Wordsworth, what does daffodils mean to you, and so forth, So that's how I proceeded with the papers. Now, this is very important today, because what are students doing today? They are getting artificial intelligence to create their papers.
Chat GPT.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, you know, if you say to them, I want to know what you think. I want to know what your mother and father think. I want to know, you know, how this text changed you. That's one of the items that Bonnie Castle says. How does a work of literature change you? What is your interpretive community in which it means? I don't want to know what artificial intelligence thinks. I don't want to know what Chat GPT thinks. You know, I go on Chat GPT and try to get it to say who I am, and it just makes a muddle of who I am. I say, who is Firoza Jasawala? And it just makes a whole muddle of things. It doesn't give my bio, it doesn't pick anything up. So Chat GPT really is just going down the drain, basically. So if you want to get away from that, then you need to see how things make meaning in a different way. But you have to understand what Roland Barthes said, which is the idea of the death of the author. Once you are an author, you write the book, it's out of your hands, it's here with the reader. It doesn't belong to you anymore. You cannot come like Salman Rushdie and say, this is not what I meant at all. You know, you remember that famous line from the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock? No, I didn't mean this. This is not what I meant. No, you can't say that. No one is going to accept that anymore. In fact, again, pursuing with that Rushdie argument, I myself went through three versions of saying what Rushdie meant. I had these three articles. The first one I wrote for Vinny Kirpal, who is at the IITs long time ago, and I said he should not have done this. This was a basic mistake. Then I decided, well, maybe we need to look at it in the context of, see, now I'm saying context or interpretive community, the context of Muslim or Islamic literary theory. And if we look at it in that context, yes, there is a tradition of blasphemy and a tradition of questioning the Quran and the Prophet and so on and so forth. So if you put it along that line, you can see that it is not so blasphemous. On the other hand, if you look at it in terms of all the things that are happening now, you can say, okay, it's Rushdie's love letter to the Islamic community saying, get away from what is the binding way of looking at the Prophet or the community or the way of being or the hadiths and this tariqats and this and that, and change your point of view. So it's basically saying if Islam is to survive, it does not need to be so dogmatic. So this is just these three essays show my own shifting perspective. This is a text you should look at. It's an old essay, but it's written by this person, and it's called Do We Write the Text We Read? Which is true, because in a sense, we write the text we read. We believe that, you know, J.L. Austin first said, we believe that all sentences do something, perform a locutionary act. So when we look at a sentence, it's performing an act for us. And how we look at it is like looking at a drama and then saying how a word makes sense, or is a sentence makes sense, or how an idea makes sense. So that's another very important way of looking at things. And then, of course, there's M.H. Abrams. As you remember, this is for those of you who are professors or faculty. This is an old textbook that has often been used and taught to us, even in the Indian context. So basically, this flies against the idea of Derrida. Derrida said, Il n'y a pas or the text. There is nothing outside the text. We can only deconstruct a text. We cannot read a text beyond or outside the text. This is not true. Because if you don't know the context of the book, then you don't understand what is going on. I'll just take a few minutes and do a little personal talk here. I'm doing a paper on this book. It's called The Bamboo Stalk, and it's written by a guy called Saud Al-Sanusi. It's an interesting novel. To me, it's a very terrifying novel. It's a terrifying novel because it talks about the ill treatment of the South Asian and the Southeast Asian people who go to the Gulf areas. This is important today, as you know, that among some of those hostages that were released in Israel, there were Thai workers from Thailand, and they had gone to make money. They are migrant workers, just like we in the US Southwest have migrant workers coming from the border lands. When I look at this book, which is a contemporary book about contemporary situations, about Filipino and South Asian laborers working in Kuwait and in the Gulf, I say this is slavery. This is slavery happening all over again. If I try to argue that case with one of my colleagues, they don't want to admit that there is continuing contemporary slavery in the Gulf areas. I don't know if you know this book. This is a Kerala book. This is written by a man called Benjamin. It's Goat Days. How many of you know it? It's very popular these days. It's about a Malayali gentleman or a Malayali poor farmer who goes to Dubai in the attempt and in the usual attempt to try to make more money or to be able to make money from come back with money. What happens to him? He's beaten up, his money's taken from him, his passport is taken from him, etc., etc., etc. And fortunately, luckily, he gets deported and back. And because he gets deported, he's back. The same thing is written about here in this book, Temporary People. And if you're in business or in engineering or thinking about different places, this is by Deepak Unikrishnan. I don't know if you all heard of him. He actually grew up in the UAE, and it's about how the temporary workers or the migrant workers are treated. And, you know, when you begin to start looking at this, you say, different people have different perspectives. On the news, they've been saying about those hostages that were taken either by Hamas or by the IDF. Oh, they were migrant workers, they came to make money. They say the same thing about the Southern American people on my border, which is not very far from where I'm sitting, because I'm almost on the most southern border of the United States. They say, oh, the migrant workers, they're coming to pick chili, they're coming to pick tomatoes, cherries, whatever it is. They want to make their life better, etc., etc. But do they get subject to slavery conditions? What kind of housing, what kind of place are they kept in? What actually happens? So these are some of the questions that are shaped by the interpretive community. So this is what I said. This is my 30-year-old dissertation in which I asked the question, what is the appropriate literary criticism or theory that we can use to look at Indian literature in English? So this is again going back to the Stephen Bonnycastle book. Reader-centered criticism begins with the experiences of individuals. A reader response critic would maintain that a poem does not make sense as words on a page. It only takes on existence when someone is reading it, and we all give slightly different meanings to the way in which we read. So the context of situation is very important to go with. So then, bringing it to Indian critical theory, I have my next argument is because each culture reads this is going to be a larger book in a larger way, but I noticed that lots of people in India are also beginning to have seminars on more indigenous perspectives on literature, or reading literature from a Dalit point of view, or reading literature from an Oriya point of view, or other kinds of things. 40 years ago, I said, if we are to make sense of Indian literature in English, perhaps we need to contextualize it in the older tradition, perhaps it's Vedic, of rasa and dhwani. So that's one of those things. And I realize I'm almost at half an hour. Am I, Ratika? You're noticing? So I'm saying it's important to bring about meaning and essence in any literary critical endeavor. What we need to look at is, how does a text make meaning? To whom does it make meaning? What is the essence you can draw from it? And how does it enrich the reader? And this rasa and dhwani idea was long developed. I'm coming back to that same first picture, by C.D. Narasimhaya. He has that Indian critical theory book, which was developed a long time ago. Of course, he's passed away a long time. He did develop it at that Simla Institute of Advanced Studies. And that was a long time ago. That's almost 40 years now. And his son runs in Mysore what is called Dhwanya Loka. Dhwanya Loka is a way of making sense, of making meaning, and who is the proper critic. The Vedic tradition has the idea of the Saharidaya, who would have been the proper critic in the sense of F.R. Lewis, which is again a very old-fashioned context. And through that, a literary critic, a sociological critic, a political critic, once located or based in their contextual situation, in their background, in their particular perspective, then they can make meaning of what is happening, not just in a literary text, but in the world around them. So that is what the basic argument of my paper is, and where I want to take this, or even take this 30-year-old thesis, is to say, maybe do another book, another edited book, to take into account indigenous perspectives. How do Native Americans read literature or a text? What is their view? What is a Muslim perspective of it? What is a Brahminical perspective? What is a Dalit perspective? What is an Assamese or tribal perspective? From what different background do people bring sense? What's a Chinese perspective? There are very many different types of Chinese ways of looking at literature and poetics. They can be Ming, they can be more of the Cantonese ways of looking at poetry and literature. So that's my next big project. My next big project is to have, or to bring together, at least basic literary critical theories that would help people, or be rooted in specific cultures, and that would help make sense of literatures from different cultures. We see now in India or on the subcontinent, there's a vast literature coming from the Northeast, from Assam and so forth, the tribal literatures. We see literatures coming in various different shapes and forms from different communities and being translated and being presented. How do you read those if you don't know the background of that author and that literary community? And that's my basic argument. Okay, now I'm open to questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. This has been a very sort of intriguing session. I mean, most of us are aware of how interpretation works and how, works are carried out of, once they're done and dusted, it's out in the hand of the viewer or the watcher, the reader. and how it's performed. I think it's the same. It goes for cinema and visual
Yes,
arts. That once it's out,
yes.
and I'm opening the floor for questions, but I have the first one. So I like to ask you about censorship in general. That, for example, what Rushdie's book did was the whole debate on, do we need censorship? What are the boundaries of censorship? And it has carried on in a very, very sort of elevated state in India in the last 10 years, when cinema, visual arts have been attacked repeatedly by censorship laws, by the name of the movie and its convolution of history and distortion. And it has led to so many times violent, uh, you know, incidents. And that brings me to the question, is that, do we need censorship where art is concerned? Do we need, I mean, can a person can a person not say that we are not going to watch this movie and deny the movie director and that pleasure that they've missed out an audience, instead of going to go all lengths to be violent about it? What are your views on this?
Well, it's become very, very prevalent. I, I have, well, this is touchy, and I don't know how to make sense of this. But this happened to me where I posted about the Kerala story, and because I work with a lot of Muslim writers and Muslim women writers, I was excoriated by people saying, "Oh, why are you promoting this movie? Because it creates a worse picture of us." And I said, I I was promoting it mostly because it was showing the plight of women. It's a kind of a feminist statement in a certain kind of way, but it offended the Muslim audience of this, our comparative literature scholars group, and also other people who said, "Oh, well, we have enough trouble anyway, and you're saying this, and then that causes Islamophobia in India, etc., etc." And the same can be said about my reading, perhaps, of Goat Days, because I'm sort of saying, why are people in Kerala converting to Islam when they could have a perfectly good life? And Kerala is a beautiful state with beautiful, but what questions, how do we answer this issue of censorship? In the United States, if Trump is reelected, there will be heavy censorship, of ideas, of materials, of what people can say, what people cannot say, even though he's the one who makes the claim that he's being censored and cannot speak, and that the judges are putting gag order on him, and so forth. So there is an answer to it. And actually, that answer is in my dissertation. It's in this book. There was an author you all may know called John Gardner, and he wrote a slim volume called On Moral Criticism, where he put the onus of what kind of material to put out on the author itself. Of course, that was before postmodernism. And of course, postmodernism said, you can't do that. The author has to write what he or she wants to write, and they cannot be asked to self censor or be sensitive. But Gardner says what literature will last is one that transcends the political communities that read and interpret it. So there censorship is a huge issue now, in a way in which it hasn't been safe for the last 100 years, because people are politically very divided in terms of their politics, in terms of their race, in terms of their religion, and so forth. So everyone is wanting something or another censored. I put the blame on us, liberal academics. Why is the blame on us as liberal academics? Because we have promoted political correctness. So we say, okay, you can't say this. You criticized a person of Black ancestry. You have done this, you have done that. Or you criticize someone who is making a feminist point of view, or you are criticized LGBTQ, you have to be very careful not to criticize. The more political correctness we put forward, the more it comes back to bite us. So the more politically correct we try to be, the more censorship comes on us, and we are told, oh, you can't say this, you can't say that, you offended this colleague, you offended that colleague, this happened, the policeman shot this one because of their color of their skin, etc. So this whole thing, this whole sense of sensitivity that we have developed ourselves as liberal academics, this is coming back to bite us in terms of governments then saying, okay, you now can't say this, you now can't say that, you can't see this, you can't see that. And I tried teaching Padmavati here, and here in America, I got, fairly tense responses, mostly from the women who said, oh, this is a terrible picture of women, this is a terrible picture of this is, it's promoting sati, it's promoting mass sati. We can't have this kind of image. I don't want my children seeing this. There were young students in the class who said, no, we don't want to see it. I've had Muslim students in my classes who have sat out the class because they won't sit through satanic verses, for instance, or if I'm teaching any Rashdi at all, they won't come to class. So it's very touchy, but it's something that we have procreated. And so it's that responsibility and that onus is on us, because political correctness is something that has come out of our effort to be diverse, to be open-minded, to be inclusive. But now the more we've pushed that, the less it's happening. And so I really don't know how to handle this particular situation of censorship. It also is very dependent on interpretive communities. It's very dependent on the political socialization and where you come from, and so forth. So that's my answer to that one, that we are the ones who have spawned the whole notion of censorship, because we are the ones who started saying, okay, this is not politically correct, don't say this, don't say that, don't offend this one, don't offend that one. So now we're paying the price for it. And that, I think, is my position on that one.
Yeah, ma'am. I think I'm quite in agreement with the what
You
you
don't have
say.
you don't have to be in agreement. I always tell my students, because of this position that I take, which is that of Bonnie Castle, where there is no right or wrong meaning, there is no particular perspective, I tell them that they are free to disagree with me. And they do disagree with me, and they will disagree with me. I've lately been having a lot of disagreements over this issue of uh, of Gulf writing, or writing in the Arab world, whether it's in English by Arab writers, Arab American writers, non-Arabic. I've been having a lot of disagreements lately about how these materials can be interpreted. We cannot say, for instance, this book Bamboo Stalk, we cannot say it's written by a white person. We cannot say it's being colonialist. We cannot say it's written by an Arab. It's written from inside the community. It's written from inside Kuwait. And it's very critical of Kuwaiti society and the way in which people function, the difference between the rich and the poor, the laborers that come, the way in which the certain laborers are treated and ill-treated. And so it's from within the community. We can't even say it's a colonialist view. It's somebody who is from within the community criticizing their community, and they have the right to criticize that community. So that's one of those issues that's extremely touchy right now, is how we interpret and the only way to do that is to make sure that your interpretation is very strongly rooted in either historical fact or in your interpretive community or in your particular particular perspective. So that's the one thing you need to provide sufficient background research to back up your point of view. And it always has to be your point of view and not ChatGPT's.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Come up to the
Ma'am,
mic.
we have another question. And
Yeah, come up to the mic.
This is a part everywhere. So in terms of teaching, so there are certain relations which has been converted to abusive words. Okay, how to teach, how to say that this is okay to say when in the crowd, like for example, Sala.
Ratika, can you repeat that to me?
But we have to obviously teach the meaning of both to kids.
Ma'am, could you hear the question?
No, could you repeat it to me, please? It's very muffled.
Okay. Yeah. So the question was that about context, and my colleague is asking that, for example, in the sort of Hindi-speaking belt, the word Sala, which is also a brother-in-law, is abusive as well as a term of affiliation. Now, when you teach or you speak, how do you navigate a context and an abuse like that?
Well, it's very difficult, and it's that's one of the central things in satanic verses, right? Because he is talking not just about Saladin Chamcha, but well, the character is called Saladin Chamcha, so it is kind of abusive, right? Because Saladin, of course, was the person who fought the Crusades, who is a historical Muslim martyr, but he shortens it, he calls him Salah. And of course, that's one thing that the Bangladeshis and others found very offensive about that particular text. It's very similar to teaching in America, where you cannot use the N word, right? So what do you do with a classic text like Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, where the word occurs and it occurs repeatedly? So we can say Twain is being colonialist. Even though we realize he's not, he has affinity with Jim. He has Huck is creating an affinity with Jim. Huck is like a child to Jim. There's a parental connection between the two of them. But that was the historical word at the time. And you cannot use that in a classroom now, or you cannot use that if you're teaching Heart of Darkness, right? So you have to kind of gloss over that and go on with it, because there are so many sensibilities that are so easily triggered. And in the US, we say, well, we alert the person, there might be a trigger point here. The media does that when they are presenting, say, scenes from Hamas and Israel. They say, trigger warning, please, make sure you are not offended by what we are presenting. And I think there are altogether too many delicate sensitivities here, and an impossibility to shift one's perspective from one to another. That's a very interesting word that you raised, because there's so much written in Rushdie criticism about that particular word, and what happens when it's used by Rushdie, and when it's applied in a certain kind of way and not applied in a certain kind of way. I think Paul Bryan's University of Washington has written about the way in which Rushdie uses that word. And it's It's everywhere. We are walking on eggshells. We have to be very careful of what we are doing as academics. So that's a very difficult point of view. So we just have to take into consideration people's sensitivities, and yet to be able to articulate or speak in class or to give the background of it. And it's not to say that just Twain gets criticized for it, but Toni Morrison does, when she's using that, and when it's a self-critical way in which the word is also used, it's also criticized. It's one thing to be an academic, it's another thing to be a writer, because that can really create writer's block. Can I describe this person in this way? Can I not describe this person in this way? If I say this, am I going to be a victim of society? Am I going to be blackballed? Can I, point this out or point that out? That's all. It will dampen literary production. It will dampen artistic production, either the censorship or the self-censorship. So that's it. But again, it's where we have led the society. It's where we have led. It's a lot of it is coming from post-colonial theory. A lot of it is coming from our criticisms of, well, the colonizers did this, they said that, and okay, so now it's all coming back to bite us. So that's one of the ways in which that develops.
I have another related question.
Yeah.
So,
When there's another question, yeah.
Yep.
Hmm.
okay, so we have to, because I am from bilingual, my PhD is in bilingual.
Mhm.
So when we are saying something in writing, instructions are writing or speaking. So many meanings have many words have different meanings. So even technical words also. So point can be one meaning in graph theory, another meaning in mathematics, another meaning in, let's say, engineering drawing or something. In social context also, one word can have many meaning, and we are not aware of what is acceptable in which state, which zone of practice, in which country. So for example, I was writing about, my thesis was on native speakers. But that is a different meaning than saying vernacular speaker. So how, as a non-literature person, can take care of it? What are the methods?
I don't know if you heard the whole bit of
No,
it, but I'll
it's very
yeah.
muffled. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So my colleague mentioned that his thesis was he's a education technology person, and his thesis was on native speakers and how a word and he's done his work in bilingualism, and how a word in a set of language will mean something else in B. And as an academician and as a teacher, one is not aware of all the sort of social and vernacular uh, student routings or backgrounds there present in the class or while teaching or while communicating. So, how can one sort of navigate this conflict of several meanings or several contexts?
Well, can one say, I'm coming at it from this particular point of view? You know who does that very skillfully? Every one of you is probably very familiar with Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, right? All of you know it. So if you go to the beginning, and I don't have it with me right now because I wasn't anticipating this question, but right at the very beginning, she positions herself. You position yourself by saying you establish your ethos, you establish your logos. She positions herself. She says, yes, I'm an Indian academic, but I'm located in US academia at a higher level, and I'm now reading this from this point of view, and I am not denigrating the practice, nor am I upholding the practice of sati, right? Right at the very beginning, she says that. There's a whole paragraph where she establishes her ethos. And I think we are at that point in our existence where we are going to have to establish that right at the very beginning of whatever kind of speech, however you talk about speech, whatever speech you are starting point at. So you have to say, I am so and so, I'm coming at things from this particular perspective. I am, uh, uh, here is my centeredness, and this is my particular point of view. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to be offensive. And maybe I should have said that right before I gave some explanations when I was talking about, how things can be interpreted or how things can be said. It's not to argue against diversity. It's not to argue against freedom of speech, but to say we have to somehow self-censor ourselves as we proceed, either in the classroom or in a lecture hall or in a particular situation, because it's very fragmented. The world is very fragmented at the moment, from political perspectives, from politicians who are leading governments, from what people are pushing for. It's a very fragmented atmosphere, and it's very important to somehow be empathetic and compassionate, to somehow or another say I don't mean to offend you. Here's how I'm using the word. This is how it probably means in very many different situations. It's become extremely important about what we say, where we say. And I'll say this: you're sitting in fairly safe classroom environments. You are not in a classroom environment in which a student can pull a gun and shoot you. In America, faculty members are going to have to be very responsible and very in tune to the fact, especially with the more and more that concealed carry is approved. You don't know when a student is going to pull out a gun and either shoot you or shoot a colleague or not. It's a time at which it's very important to be very aware of what's going on around you, or even what you say in a market. You could accidentally say something, offend somebody, they pull out a gun and they shoot you. So it's at that point now of cultural fragmentation. And this is where the reader response becomes important. This is where the interpretive community becomes important. This is where it's important to be looking at how you are perceived and how you are then seen in a position of conflict or not conflict. So
Thank you, ma'am.
that's the important thing.
Thank you so much. I'd like to close the session, and before I do, I want to tell you that earlier this year, I think we were in a discussion in a Facebook community group where you mentioned ChatGPT and how you had started the practice of asking students to write gut reaction papers about the text they're reading. And that really motivated me. And it's a technique that I started using since this year onward, about asking students to write their first reaction or gut reaction papers. So I want to thank you for that bit of suggestion. And I want to thank you profusely for this session. very, very enlightening, and thank you for the generous answers that you've given. It's sort of leading a path, and we'll see where the way takes us. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, ma'am. It's been an
Thank-
honor and privilege to hear you.
Thank you. I hope I haven't said anything offensive. And if I have, I apologize in advance.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good night, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.